Okay, so um, let's talk. Let's take a bit of let's talk about a bit of a different subject. So last class we were talking about attitudes, and the basic idea when we're talking about attitudes is that our attitudes can, under the right circumstances, lead us to behave in ways that are consistent with those attitudes. And now what we're going to do is we're going to flip that on its head a little bit. So let me share my screen so I can get started with this. In particular, oops. In particular, we're going to talk about one of the most famous theories in all of social psychology, something that was developed in the late 50s and into the 60s. And it spurned a whole bunch of research. There are hundreds upon hundreds of studies that have looked at this theory. And it takes a kind of a bit of a counterintuitive perspective on the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. Let me describe the basic idea behind what is known as cognitive dissonance theory. And you'll see how in this theory, instead of attitudes leading to behaviors, what we're going to talk about really is how our behaviors, the things we choose to do, can lead us to develop attitudes that are consistent with those behaviors. So here's the basic idea. In general, we like it when all of our thoughts and our beliefs and our attitudes and our behaviors are all consistent with one another, right? I mean, if you are very anti-cheating and you were to cheat, well, that's pretty hypocritical of you, right? Your attitude and your behavior, they wouldn't match. They wouldn't go together well. So we like everything to be consistent. We like to behave in a way that's consistent with our attitudes and our beliefs. But we don't always do that. There are many circumstances in which we'll behave in a way that more or less contradicts our attitudes or contradicts our beliefs in some way. Now, when that happens, when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with a belief that we have. So in the example I used, if we're anti-cheating, if that's our attitude, and our behavior is that we did in fact cheat on a test, well, that discrepancy between our behavior and our attitudes leads to aversive arousal, meaning it leads us to feel uncomfortable. We don't like it. That feeling that we get, that uncomfortable feeling that we get when our behaviors don't match our attitudes, is known as cognitive dissonance. As the name implies, it occurs when there's a dissonance or there's a disjunction between a belief and a behavior, and we don't behave in a way that's consistent with our beliefs. Cognitive dissonance theory is all about how we deal with that cognitive dissonance. It's all about how we try to get rid of that aversive arousal, how we get rid of cognitive dissonance, because we really don't like to experience it. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the entire week, basically. Because although the idea seems simple, there's a lot of important implications that come out of cognitive dissonance theory. Okay. So the whole idea here is that we are motivated to reduce this negative, uncomfortable feeling, this negative arousal that we experience when our behavior conflicts with our attitudes. So let's take a look at a couple, basically 5 ways that we have of trying to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling. So let's take an example that was originally proposed by the researcher who originally came up with this idea. And the idea is this. Let's say that you consider yourself to be a very healthy person. You like to work out and eat well, etc. But you smoke cigarettes. Well, that's a bit of a problem here, right? Because your attitude is that you're a very healthy person, and yet you're engaging in a behavior that we know to be fairly unhealthy. So according to cognitive dissonance theory, that's going to create this negative, uncomfortable arousal, this negative feeling. And we're going to try to get rid of it in one of a number of ways. Let's look at a couple of the options that people have of how to get rid of their cognitive dissonance. Well, recall that the main issue is that our attitude and our behavior don't match, right? They conflict. Well, obviously then, one thing we can do is we can change our attitude to bring it in line with our behavior. So for instance, if our attitude is, I'm a healthy person, maybe we admit to ourselves, you know what, I'm not really a healthy person. I don't really put a lot of emphasis on behaving in a healthy way. Or alternatively, we can change our attitude towards our beliefs about smoking. After all, if we can convince ourselves that smoking really isn't that unhealthy to begin with, then in fact, my behavior is not incongruent, is not dissonant with my attitude that I'm a healthy person, if I can convince myself that smoking isn't unhealthy. So that's one option that we have. However, in this case in particular, it might be hard to convince yourself that smoking isn't unhealthy because we have decades of research and it's pretty easily conclusive that smoking is unhealthy for your lungs, right? So that strategy may not actually work in this specific case. So let's try another strategy. Well, again, if the problem is that our attitude doesn't match our behavior, well, instead of bringing our attitude in line with our behavior, maybe we bring our behavior in line with our attitude. In other words, we simply quit smoking. If we quit smoking, we're no longer engaged in a behavior that conflicts with our attitude, and we get rid of the dissonance entirely. So theoretically, changing our behavior would get rid of this cognitive dissonance. But again, in this particular situation, it might be hard to quit that behavior. It might be hard to quit smoking if you've been smoking for a long time and you're addicted and you like the feeling that it gives you. So that may or may not work in this case, right? Now, those are the two most obvious ways of reducing dissonance, but we're going to look at three alternative ways we have of reducing dissonance as well. So a third strategy that we might have is to what is called adding consonant cognitions. Now, a consonant cognition is the opposite of a dissonant cognition. So if what caused cognitive dissonance in the first place is when our behavior and our attitude doesn't match, well, one thing we might be able to do is to add a belief, add a cognition, a belief that is consistent with our pre-existing attitude and our behavior. And this maybe will make more sense when I give you a more concrete example. So let's say that I can convince myself that if I smoke, well, smoking suppresses my appetite and therefore it causes me to lose weight, and losing weight is healthy. So in a sense then, smoking is kind of healthy because it helps me to lose weight. And if I can convince myself of that, then you can see that I'm sort of reducing or diluting the effect of the dissonance between my attitude and my behavior. The idea here is that we're adding a new belief. In this case, the belief is smoking helps me lose weight. And that belief is consistent with both my behavior, which is that I'm smoking, and smoking helps me lose weight, and my attitude, which is that I'm a healthy person, and losing weight helps me become a healthy person. Okay? So adding a new belief dilutes the problem. It gets rid of that cognitive dissonance, in other words. Alternatively, as a fourth option, what we might do is try to minimize the importance of the conflict. In this case, what we're doing is we're saying, yes, my behavior doesn't match my attitude. I smoke and I consider myself a healthy person. But what I'm doing in this case is I'm saying, you know what, though, that doesn't really matter. After all, we're all going to die at some point anyway, right? So I might as well enjoy myself while I'm here. So even though I engage in one thing that's not healthy, at least I can enjoy myself while I'm smoking. Right? So we're acknowledging the conflict exists. We're just saying that that conflict doesn't really matter. Or a fifth strategy that we might have to reduce cognitive dissonance is to reduce perceived choice. So let's say that you consider yourself a healthy person and you don't smoke, but someone comes up to you and puts a gun to your head and tells you to smoke a cigarette. Well, if someone were to do that, you would smoke that cigarette and you wouldn't have any problems with it. You wouldn't experience cognitive dissonance because you were forced to do that behavior. You didn't choose to engage in that behavior. And just like you wouldn't feel guilty if someone forced you to smoke, if you can convince yourself that you were forced to smoke for some other reason, that also should reduce cognitive dissonance. So for instance, maybe you work at a company and everyone takes smoke breaks and you say, well, you know, you have to take a smoke break with them because if you don't, they're all going to gossip about you and you can't have that happen. So you're basically forced to go on a smoke break with them, right? I had no choice. Everyone else was smoking as well. And if everyone else is smoking and you're basically forced into it, then that should reduce the cognitive dissonance that you experience as well. So this is what cognitive dissonance theory is about. It's about the ways in which we use these 5 strategies to reduce the discrepancy between our behavior and our attitudes. And one thing that you should note here is that cognitive dissonance is, to some extent, a way that we kind of lie to ourselves or delude ourselves, right? I mean, if we are able to convince ourselves that smoking isn't unhealthy, we're effectively lying to ourselves, right? Because of course smoking is unhealthy for our lungs. Or if we try to convince ourselves that we had no choice, well, most of the time we do have a choice in what behaviors we take on. But if we can convince ourselves we were forced into it and we're sort of lying to ourselves about that, that will reduce the cognitive dissonance as well. Or if we can convince ourselves that this new consonant cognition is true, that smoking helps me lose weight, that reduces cognitive dissonance as well. But that requires me to convince myself that, in fact, the health benefits of smoking by losing weight outweigh the costs of smoking to my lungs, for instance. So there's a way in which, due to this desire that we have to get rid of this conflict, to get rid of this negative arousal, to get rid of the cognitive dissonance, that leads us to often lie to ourselves. We don't realize we're lying to ourselves, of course. We're convinced by the lie, but it often will lead us to sort of delude ourselves in that way. Now, what we're going to look at in the next couple classes are 3 domains in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects. So the way that I've been explaining cognitive dissonance so far is in terms of this first domain, which is justifying attitude discrepant behavior. Meaning, when we engage in behavior that's discrepant or different from our attitudes, we feel a need to justify it. And a second ago, when I said that cognitive dissonance theory is about the ways that we lie to ourselves or delude ourselves, that's another way of saying that we're justifying our behavior. Okay? Cognitive dissonance theory is oftentimes about the justifications that we come up with for the behaviors that we engaged in. But that's not the only arena or domain in which we tend to see cognitive dissonance effects. So later on, we're going to look at 2 other areas in which we see cognitive dissonance effects as well. We'll probably get to these next class. One is in terms of justifying effort. So for instance, if we have to engage or go through a lot of effort in order to join a group, we will feel a need to justify having gone through that effort. And that's going to result in some cognitive dissonance effects that we're going to look at next class. Or as a third domain in which we see cognitive dissonance, we're going to see that when we have a difficult decision to make, maybe it's which of 2 graduate schools I want to go to, or which of 2 people would I like to date. When we have to make those difficult decisions, we have this tendency to justify the decision that we made in order to reduce the cognitive dissonance that was created. So we're also going to look at that later on Thursday. So we'll come back to points 2 and 3 later on. Let's focus on this first point, though. This idea that we often will justify the behaviors we engage in that conflict with our prior attitudes. So what I want to do is describe to you the original famous study, and this is one of the most famous studies in social psychology, probably top 5 or so, that shows cognitive dissonance effects. This was done way back in the late 1950s. And the guy who came up with this theory, his name was Leon Festinger. He's the same guy that came up with social comparison theory. So he's a really big name in social psychology because cognitive dissonance theory and social comparison theory are 2 of the most famous theories in all of social psychology. In any case, at this time, he's looking into cognitive dissonance effects. So here's what he does. He brings participants into his lab one at a time. And he tells them that for the next half hour, he's going to sit them in a room by themselves, and he gives them a board. And on this board are a series of pegs. So each peg has like a shape cut out of it, and it has a little handle on it, so it fits right into the little hole that's on that board. Okay? And what they're told to do is that with one hand, and with one hand only, they are to take the first peg in the upper left-hand corner of the square, pull it up, and drop it in a box. They're then going to go to the second peg, pull the second peg up, drop it in a box. And they're going to repeat that process over and over until all of the pegs are off this board and into this box. And then when they're done, they're going to take a peg out of the box and they're going to put it into the first hole on the board. And they're going to take another peg out of the box and put it into the second hole. And they're going to repeat that process until all the pegs are back into this board. And when they're done with that, they're going to repeat the process again and again and again. In fact, for the next 30 minutes, imagine you're one of these participants. For 30 minutes straight, you're engaging in one of the most mind-numbingly boring tasks you could imagine. Okay? Just moving pegs from here to here and back. That's all you're doing for half an hour. People find this very unpleasant, right? It's extremely boring and it's extremely dull. And finally, at the end of these 30 minutes, the experimenter comes back and you are thankful that finally, this awful task is over. And he says, actually, for the next half hour, I've got another task for you. Because this other task, what I have is a box full of spools of thread. And you've got another board with pegs that are sticking out like this. And you've got to take with one hand only a spool of thread and put it on the first peg, and go back and take another spool of thread, put on the second peg, and repeat that process until all spools of thread are on all the pegs. And when you're done, you're going to go back to the beginning, take the spool of thread off and dump it in the box, take the second spool of thread off, dump it in the box, repeat that process. And then you're going to repeat that again and again and again. And for another mind-crushingly boring 30 minutes, that's all you do. So basically, for an hour, you're engaged in the most boring task imaginable. It's going to be key for later on. Finally, at the end of the hour, I save you, I as the experimenter, and I say, okay, look, thank you for participating in the study. Let me tell you a little bit about what this study was about. Okay. Well, in fact, what we're looking for in this study, and by the way, I should say I'm lying to all participants when I tell them this. This is not what the study is about, but this is what I'm telling you. What the study is about is looking at the effects of motivation on performance. And so what we've done is we've taken some people, randomly, some people, we gave them a motivating statement telling them how much fun this study was prior to having them engage in these tasks. And the other half of the people, the control group, that's the group you were in, you did not get any motivating statements. You were just thrown into this task and you performed this really, really boring task. Okay. Now, at this point, you as the participant, you think the study's over. In fact, the study's only just beginning. Because at this point, I now randomly assign you to one of three conditions. For a third of you, you're in the control condition. And people in the control condition are simply told, okay, now that the study's over, the university has a questionnaire that they want participants to fill out just to make sure that the studies that we're conducting serve a purpose and that the participants aren't too bored by them. We just want to know what your impressions of the study are. I just have a quick survey. It'll take 5 minutes if you just fill it out for me. Okay. Now, on that survey are a number of questions, including how interesting was this study? Would you like to do another similar study, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's one group. People who are in the second group, well, I guess I should say, people who are in the second and third groups are in a condition where the following happens. After I tell you what the study is supposedly about, I then get a phone call, and I leave the room to take the phone call, and I come back a minute later, and at that point, I say the following. I've got a bit of a problem, because the person who just called me on the phone, that was one of my graduate students, and they're supposed to help me with this research. Here's the problem. Their car just broke down, but I have another participant waiting in the waiting room to go through the study. The problem is the person who's waiting in the waiting room, they're in the condition where they're supposed to be given a motivating statement. We're supposed to tell them how much fun this study is. And my research assistant, like my graduate student, was supposed to tell them this, but because their car broke down, they can't make it in here. So I've got a bit of a problem because they're already here in the waiting room. And so I was hoping you could do me a favor. If you can choose to say no, but I would really appreciate it if you could go into that waiting room and tell the next participant how much fun this study was. In other words, what I'm asking you to do is to basically lie through your teeth, right? Okay, so and I'll tell you what, if you can tell the next participant how much fun the study was, I'll give you $1 to do so. That's what some of you are told. Now, even in 1959, $1 is not that much money. I'm really asking you to lie, right? To completely lie to another participant. Tell them how much fun the study was, even though it was completely boring, and I'm going to pay you $1. Not that much money. But the third group of people, they go through the exact same process as that second group, except with one difference. So I ask you, if you would be willing to go and tell the next participant how much fun the study is, if you'd be willing to do that, I'll give you $20. Okay, so the only difference between the second and third groups, because both groups lie to the next participant, but the only difference is that in group 2, I give them $1 to lie. In group 3, I give them $20 to lie. Okay. So I've got 3 conditions. Some people never lie at all. Some people lie for $1. Some people lie for $20. Now in groups 2 and 3, after they tell the next participant how much fun the study is, I then tell them, look, the university is conducting a survey. They have a questionnaire here they want me to give you just to see how interesting people find the studies, et cetera, et cetera. And I give people the same survey that people in the control condition got. So again, on that survey, they're asked a number of questions, including how much fun the study was. And that's going to be the key outcome metric. So if you looked at how people responded to that question, how much fun did you have in this study? How is that going to differ as a function of these three conditions? In other words, which group of people will later come to rate the task, this really mind-numbingly boring task? Which group of them will rate that task as more enjoyable? Well, let's take a look. So this is their rating of how much fun they had in the study. Okay, so let's first start by looking at the control condition, the people who never lied. Well, of course, the people who never lied, they went through this horribly boring study, and they, of course, rated it as very low. It's not very enjoyable at all. They really don't like it, right? So that's our control condition. Now let's look at our $20 lie and our $1 lie conditions. In our $20 lie condition, those participants also rated the task as pretty boring. They correctly recognized how boring the study was. But, and here's the key, in the $1 condition, the people who were paid $1 to tell the next person how much fun this study was, they come to actually say they actually like the study. Now, why would that be the case? Why would people who are paid $1 to tell the next participant how much fun this study was, why would they come to say they like the task more? Now, keep in mind, these people are not lying on the questionnaire, because these questionnaires are anonymous. These are people who truly believe that the study was a lot of fun. They've come to convince themselves. They've basically deluded themselves into thinking the study was fun. Now, why is that the case? It looks like Anthony already has the answer to this. You're basically right. So here's the basic idea. Let's imagine you're one of these participants. Okay? So you know the study's boring. And I'm telling you, okay, you've got to tell the next person the study's really fun, right? So your behavior and your attitude don't match. I'm saying it's really fun. I really didn't think it was fun at all. You're lying, right? You're selling your soul. But you know what? You're being paid $20 to do so. And you're willing to lie a little bit. You're willing to relax your morals a little bit. You're willing to do that. You're willing to engage in a behavior that conflicts with your attitudes as long as you get enough of an extrinsic reward, an extrinsic motivator, like $20. You're willing to do that. But now imagine you're someone in the $1 lie condition. Okay, so imagine that you believe the study's boring. And now I'm asking you to tell someone else the study's really fun. And I'm only paying you $1 to do so. Well, that's a little bit awkward, right? Because you're not really willing to completely lie and to relax your morality for $1, right? That's going to create all this cognitive dissonance within you. So what are you going to do about that cognitive dissonance? Well, you know what? Actually, the more that I think about it, that study was actually kind of fun. If you really think about it, the study was kind of fun. And that's exactly what these participants did. They convinced themselves the study was actually enjoyable. Because if they were able to do that, then their behavior, which is telling the other participant the study's fun, is completely consistent with their attitude. So in other words, the $1 lie people experienced cognitive dissonance when their behavior conflicted with their attitudes. To get rid of that cognitive dissonance, they changed their attitude. Remember, that's the first strategy I talked about of ways to reduce our cognitive dissonance. Right? They changed their attitude. They came to convince themselves the study was actually fun. That way, they don't have to feel bad about lying to the other participant because they didn't actually lie. They still thought the study was fun. Now, this was contrary. These results were contrary to what most psychologists thought at the time. At the time, the idea was that, well, if you're paid to lie, the more you're paid to lie, the more you will come to believe it. That was the idea. But if that was the case, then we should have seen the $20 lie people come to really think the study was fun, not the $1 lie people. Right? So what these findings are doing is they're kind of flipping common sense on its head. And this all hinges on a concept known as sufficient justification. Here's the idea. If you engage in a behavior that conflicts with your attitude, we will not experience cognitive dissonance if we have what's known as sufficient justification for why we engaged in that behavior. So, for example, in the study I just described to you, if you lie and tell someone how much fun the study is, which conflicts with your attitudes, You won't experience cognitive dissonance if you have sufficient justification, if you were paid a lot of money to do so, in other words. If we have a strong enough extrinsic reason because we were paid to do something, for instance, then we don't experience cognitive dissonance. Because we know we're lying, but we're willing to lie if we're getting paid enough money to do so. Okay, another way of saying this is that the greater the reward, so in this case, being paid $20, the less likely attitude is to change. But if you're paid only a small amount, only $1, that's not enough of a reason. We don't have sufficient justification. And that's when that motivates us to engage in strategies to reduce our cognitive dissonance. Okay? So the key takeaway here is that when we have sufficient justification, we do not experience cognitive dissonance. Because we acted contrary to our attitudes, but we did it for a tangible reason. In this case, we did it for the $20. In fact, this happens to us all the time. Most of us like to think that we're an honest person, right? I'm an honest person. And yet, all of us lie to some extent to people all the time. Now, most of the time, hopefully, it's like little minor lies, right? That aren't really that big a deal. So maybe you're trying to protect someone's feelings. So maybe someone close to you asks you, do you like these jeans that I bought? Maybe you don't really like those jeans, but they already bought them. There's no point in you saying, no, I don't like them. So you say, yeah, they look good on you, even though you don't really think that. It's a little white lie, right? Now you're lying, which goes against your beliefs about yourself. I'm an honest person. That's my attitude. And yet I'm telling this person a lie. That should create cognitive dissonance, right? But it doesn't, because we have sufficient justification for why we engaged in that behavior. We did it to protect their feelings, right? That's a good enough external reason to behave a little bit against our attitudes. And so because of that, we don't experience cognitive dissonance in that case. Right? Or imagine that you're a part of a wedding, right? And you're a bridesmaid, let's say, and the bride buys some dresses for you, and you go to her house and you try on the bridesmaid dresses. And after you try it on, you walk out of the bathroom and it looks like this, right? And the bride says, how do you like these bridesmaid dresses that I got you? And you grit your teeth and you say, oh, I love them, right? Now, obviously you don't like this dress, but you're lying to them, but you're doing it to protect her feelings. You're willing to go against your attitudes to protect your friend's feelings, right? So that doesn't produce cognitive dissonance. Now, of course, the opposite of sufficient justification is insufficient justification. Insufficient justification occurs when we act contrary to our attitudes, but we can't point to a tangible reason. We can't point to a reason for why we did. These are the people in the $1 condition in the study I just described to you. These are people who lied to someone else, who said the study was fun, even though they didn't find it fun at all. And they can't say they did it for the money because they were only paid $1, right? There's no tangible reason. In other words, they had insufficient justification for why they acted against their attitudes. Under these conditions, when you have insufficient justification for your behavior, that's when you've got to convince yourself that your behavior was not really inconsistent with your attitudes. That's when you're going to start to experience cognitive dissonance. Why would you lie to someone if you only did it for $1? Well, it's not really lying because I really actually kind of like the study, right? In this case, you changed your attitude to match your behavior. You did that to get rid of the dissonance created because you engaged in behavior that conflicted with your attitudes for insufficient justification. Okay? So the key here, again, when you have insufficient justification, you don't have a good reason for your behavior, that's when we experience cognitive dissonance. And that's when we engage in one of these 5 cognitive dissonance reduction strategies that we talked about. Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's look at another study from the 60s. Now, what these researchers wanted to do is they wanted to get people to engage in a behavior that conflicted with their attitudes. And in particular, what they wanted to do is they assumed, the people in their study, they probably don't want to eat a grasshopper. But you know what? We're going to get them to do it. We're going to see if that produces cognitive dissonance. Now, they couldn't do this with college undergraduates. We can't make you guys eat grasshoppers. That would be unethical to do. But what they did is they found Army recruits. And it turns out you can do a lot more with Army recruits than you can with undergraduate students. So they did this study with a bunch of Army recruits. And they had a superior officer to these Army recruits ask them to eat a grasshopper. And the person that was asking them to eat a grasshopper was either someone they liked or someone they did not like. Now, these Army recruits all went along with this. They all ate the grasshopper. So their attitude is, I don't want to eat a grasshopper. Their behavior is, I ate a grasshopper. Which group of people is going to come to convince themselves that, in fact, you know what, actually, I kind of liked eating the grasshopper? Well, let's think about this for a second. Let's imagine that you're one of these Army recruits, okay? And someone that you like asks you to eat a grasshopper. So you eat that grasshopper. So you behaved in a manner inconsistent with your attitudes. The question is, before we know if you experienced cognitive dissonance, did you have sufficient justification for that behavior? Well, you can always say, you know what, I ate a grasshopper, I don't really like it, but you know, I did it, I know why, I did it as a favor to this person that I really like. In other words, they had sufficient justification. When they have sufficient justification, they don't experience cognitive dissonance. They don't feel a need to reduce that cognitive dissonance. So therefore, when you later ask those people, did you like eating the grasshopper? They say, no, I did not. I hated eating that grasshopper. Now what happens in the other group? So imagine you're one of these Army recruits and someone you don't like asks you to eat this grasshopper and you go along with it, right? So you acted in a way that conflicts with your attitudes. Now, the question becomes, did you have sufficient justification for your behavior? Well, not really, right? Because you can't say you did it as a favor to this person because you don't even like that person. We don't do favors for people we don't like. So in that case, why did I eat this grasshopper? Well, you know what? I actually, now that I think about it, I actually kind of like the taste of grasshopper. And so I ate it because I wanted to, not because they asked me to. And so what the people in that condition did is they convinced themselves they really actually liked eating grasshopper. They're the ones who experienced cognitive dissonance because they had insufficient justification and came to change their attitudes to bring them in line with their behavior. We can see all sorts of examples of people attempting to reduce their cognitive dissonance by changing their attitudes. I'll give you a few examples. These are all based on studies, okay? So in this study, college students were told that they were going to be delivering a speech on why it's important to use condoms. And they were told that they were either going to be giving this speech just in a private room and no one's ever going to see it outside of this experiment, or they were going to be giving the speech that's video recorded and it was going to be shown to high school classes all around the country. So in other words, they were either making a public commitment to their stance that you should always use condoms, or they were not making a public commitment. Okay. So after giving this speech, the researcher says, well, thank you for participating in this study. Now, as a thank you for our participants, what we do is we have a bowl of condoms here. This is a study about safe sex practices. So we have a bowl of condoms here. Feel free to take as many as you want as a thank you for being in this study. And the researcher leaves so that people don't feel embarrassed about taking them. And so participants take however many they want from the bowl and they leave the study. So the researchers come back and they know how many condoms were in the bowl to begin with. And so by a process of subtraction, they could figure out how many condoms the participant took. And so they wanted to know, would people take more condoms depending on which condition of the study they were in? Now, what happened was this, that people who had given this speech about why you should always use condoms, and they believed it was going to be shown to high school students all around the country, those people who made that public commitment that they're pro-condom, they ended up taking more condoms than the students who gave a speech that they thought was never going to be shown to anybody. And the reason for this, they explained, is due to cognitive dissonance theory. The idea is that if you make a public commitment that my attitude, I am very pro-condom, and everyone is going to know about it because I'm making a public statement that this is my attitude. If I later engage in a behavior that conflicts with that attitude, so I don't use condoms in my own sex life, for instance, that's going to create a massive amount of cognitive dissonance, right? To avoid that cognitive dissonance, they ended up taking a lot of condoms. But for the participants who gave the same speech, but they did it privately, that was never going to be shown, they never really publicly committed to that attitude. because they never publicly committed to that attitude, if they later didn't use condoms in their own life, that wouldn't really conflict with their attitudes because they never really publicly committed to it. So they felt less cognitive dissonance. Because they felt less cognitive dissonance, they didn't end up taking as many condoms. Okay. So what happened here, and by the way, the researchers followed up with these people over the next couple months, and the people who were in the condition that made a public statement about being pro condoms actually reported using more condoms themselves than people who did not make that public commitment. And so what happened here is these researchers effectively leveraged the idea of cognitive dissonance to change people's, in this case, safe sex behavior. I'll give you another example. This is kind of a semi-famous story. So we're going to go back a couple hundred years. Okay? When Benjamin Franklin was in the legislature, he had an enemy, but he wanted to make this person his friend. So now at the time, we had no idea what cognitive dissonance was. So it's not like he knew what cognitive dissonance was, but he used a strategy that we later realized was capitalizing on this idea of cognitive dissonance. Here's what he did. He knew that this person, his enemy, had this really big library at home. And it had a lot of rare books. So he went to his enemy and he said, would you be willing to loan me this book for a week and then I'll return it to you at the end of the week? And his enemy did that. He loaned Benjamin Franklin the book. Benjamin Franklin read it. At the end of the week, he returned it. And from that point on, they were friends. But what happened? Well, there's a whole lot of psychology going on behind the scenes. Let's imagine, take the perspective of Benjamin Franklin's enemy. Imagine you're in his shoes. So Benjamin Franklin comes to you and asks you to borrow a book, and you agree to do so. Okay? Now, why did you loan Benjamin Franklin that book? After all, he's your enemy, right? We don't do favors for our enemies. So our behavior, which is I did a favor for Benjamin Franklin, conflicts with our attitude. I don't like Benjamin Franklin, but I did him a favor. Why would I do that? Well, actually, now that I think about it, actually, you know what? I actually like Benjamin Franklin. And this person came to convince himself he actually liked Benjamin Franklin because in doing so, that justified his prior behavior. If I like Benjamin Franklin, then it makes sense that I would loan him. So to avoid that cognitive dissonance, this guy came to convince himself that he actually liked Benjamin Franklin. But this has some important implications. Because imagine that you are in Benjamin Franklin's shoes. Let's imagine that you have someone that maybe doesn't like you so much, or maybe they're neutral towards you, and you want them to like you. You want to be friends with that person, let's say. Most of us, our common sense ideas would be, well, we do nice things for that person. That'll get them to like us. Okay, that might work. But a better strategy, perhaps, is not to do a nice thing for that person, but to get that person to do a nice thing for you. Because once they do you a favor, they've got to justify why they did that favor, which they'll often do by convincing themselves they really like you. That's basically what Benjamin Franklin did. He used cognitive dissonance principles. Or take this cheating example that I brought up at the beginning of class. Okay? What these researchers did is they went into a classroom of kids and they administered a questionnaire that asked them, what is your attitude towards cheating? And the kids' attitudes were mixed on cheating. Some were okay with it. It's not the greatest thing in the world. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of mediocre. There's a bit of a mix, but in general, they're kind of mediocre with it. Okay? Then what they did is they gave a test to all these kids, and they set up a situation such that it was really easy for the kids to cheat. Now, some kids cheated in that situation, and some kids didn't cheat. Finally, after that test was done, and the researchers, by the way, could monitor, they could see who's cheating or not. Imagine they have like hidden cameras in there. So they could see which kids cheated and which didn't. Then after that test, they went back and they administered that first questionnaire again on their attitudes towards cheating. And they wanted to see if the kids' attitudes towards cheating changed. Okay? So what we're seeing here, this y-axis, are the kids' attitudes towards cheating. Higher bars means they have a more positive attitudes towards cheating. They're more accepting of it. Lower bars means they're less accepting. I think it's really bad. Okay? So what we can do is we can divide the kids into two groups, the kids who would cheat and the kids who would not cheat. We know that because we monitored them during that actual situation. So before they were given the test, obviously we don't know who cheated or not. But once they cheated or not, we can then retroactively figure out who cheated. And so among the kids who would eventually cheat, their attitudes were mediocre. Among the kids who would eventually not cheat, their attitudes were also mediocre towards cheating. There wasn't much of a difference between those two groups. But what happened is that when the researchers re-administered that questionnaire, suddenly their attitudes changed. So among the students who decided to cheat, suddenly their attitudes become much more relaxed towards cheating. You know what? It's not that big of a deal at all. And among the kids who didn't cheat, their attitudes become much more punitive, much harsher towards cheating. You know, cheating is a really, really awful thing that you should never do. So these students' attitudes change. Now, why did they change? Well, imagine you're one of these cheating students, right? You're like, you have a mediocre attitude towards cheating. It's not great, it's not the worst thing, it's whatever. But then you cheat on a test, right? Well, if your attitude is, I'm against cheating, but I cheated on a test, that's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. We don't like that. How do we get rid of that cognitive dissonance? Well, if we can convince ourselves that, you know what, cheating's really not that big a deal at all, then suddenly our behavior, which is that we cheated, is no longer inconsistent with their attitudes. So these cheaters, this blue bar, because of cognitive dissonance, they came to convince themselves that in fact, cheating's not a big deal. They justified their behavior that way. On the other hand, the non-cheaters, they also have a mediocre attitude towards cheating, but then they're placed in a situation where they're able to cheat, but they didn't, right? Well, if cheating wasn't a big deal, but I didn't do it, well, why wouldn't I have cheated, right? If it's not a big deal. So they come to convince themselves that cheating is like the worst thing in the world you can do. That way, their behavior, which is that I didn't cheat when I was given the opportunity, is consistent with their attitude, which is cheating is a really bad thing. Okay? So this is why we see these differing shifts in people's attitudes. It's a way to reduce the cognitive dissonance that was created. So I started off this lecture saying that cognitive dissonance focuses a lot on not on how attitudes cause behaviors, but rather on how behaviors cause attitudes. And here's a great example of that. Because what we're seeing here is that the act of cheating led these students to develop a more relaxed attitude towards cheating to reduce their dissonance. And the act of not cheating led those students to develop a more stringent, a harsher attitude towards cheating. So what we're seeing is that in these cases, the behavior is coming first, and then as a way to justify that behavior, we change our attitudes. That's how behaviors can lead to attitudes sometimes. As another example of justifying behaviors, we can look to studies that have looked at punishment. Because so far we've looked at people getting rewards for engaging in behaviors, right? People who are paid $20 for engaging in a behavior that conflicts with their attitudes. But the same logic applies if people are, instead of rewarded, if they're punished for given behaviors. So I'll walk you through a study that looked at this. This is a study that looked at 5-year-olds. Okay? And these 5-year-olds were in a lab, and there were a bunch of toys in this lab, including this one really desirable toy. This one toy that all the kids really, really wanted to play with. Now, what the researchers did is they told the kids one of two things. They randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. They were either given a really harsh punishment, saying, or I guess I should say a harsh threat of punishment, saying, look, I'm going to leave the room for 5 minutes. If you play with that toy, you are in such trouble when I get back, right? Basically giving this really harsh threat. If you play with the toy, you're going to get this really big punishment. Or the other group of kids were in a condition in which they were given only a mild threat. They were told, look, see that toy over there? I would really like it if you don't play with that toy while I'm gone. It's kind of a mild threat, right? So the researcher leaves for 5 minutes, and the kids were good. None of the kids played with the toy. Okay? The researchers come back 5 minutes later, and they ask the kids, how much do you want to play with that toy right there? Now, what they showed is that the kids who had previously received a mild threat, if they had played with that toy, they liked the toy less than the kids who had previously been given a severe threat. Now, let's look at why this is the case from a cognitive dissonance perspective. So again, imagine you're a kid in this case. Imagine you're a 5-year-old kid in the, let's start with the severe threat condition, okay? So you were given a severe threat that you're gonna be really punished if you play with this toy. So your attitude is, I want to play with this toy. Your behavior is, I'm not playing with this toy, right? There's a discrepancy there. So the question is, do you have sufficient justification for why you're not playing with that toy? Well, yeah, you do, because you're going to get really punished really strongly if you play with that toy. So you're engaging in a behavior, not playing with the toy, that conflicts with your attitude, but you know exactly why you're doing it. You're doing it because you're going to get a big punishment. we have sufficient justification for our behavior. As a consequence, we don't experience any cognitive dissonance. And as a consequence, we still really want to play with that toy. We still know that we want to play with it. We still really like it. Right? But now imagine you're a kid in the mild threat condition. You have a behavior, I didn't play with the toy, and you have an attitude, I really want to play with the toy. The question is, do you have sufficient justification? And now you're thinking, well, it's not because I'm being threatened with punishment because it's only a mild threat. That's not a big deal. So you have insufficient justification for why you didn't play with that toy. Cognitive dissonance kicks in, right? You have this negative, uncomfortable arousal. To get rid of that uncomfortable feeling, what do? You know what? I didn't want to play with that toy anyway. That's why I'm not playing with it, right? So these kids convinced themselves they didn't want to play with the toy in order to reduce the dissonance that was created otherwise. All because they had insufficient justification. They had only a mild threat. To Mark in the chat, I see, wouldn't you enjoy something more if it's harder to achieve? You're actually hitting on the second domain of cognitive dissonance. So that exact point is what we're going to get back to later on. Okay, so keep that question till then. The main point I want to bring up here is that our natural inclination is that if you want to prevent someone from doing something, if you have a child, for instance, you want to prevent them from doing something, our natural inclination is to give them the most severe threat possible, right? Maybe you have a teenager and they're going to a party and you don't want them to drink. So you say, you know, you better not drink while you're at that party or else you are in such huge trouble. That's our natural inclination if we want to stop that behavior. What a study like this shows is that that natural inclination is exactly backwards. What we should be doing is giving people a mild threat. As long as that mild threat is enough to stop the behavior, then what's going to happen is that people in that mild threat condition are going to have insufficient justification for why they didn't engage in that behavior. If they go to the party and they don't drink, they can't say, well, I'm not drinking because I'm in big trouble, right? They're going to have to say, well, I'm not drinking, but why am I not drinking? Well, it's not because of the threat. I wasn't very threatened. It must be because you know what? I don't really want to drink anyway. That's why I'm not drinking. And so the people in the mild threat condition come to convince themselves they didn't want to engage in that behavior in the first place. And so that's sort of a more effective way, if you want to sort of mold a child's behavior, say, the most effective way is to use a milder threat to get the child to internalize that they didn't want to do it themselves anyway, as a means of reducing cognitive dissonance. I'll give you one more example. I'll use the example of when we went to war with Iraq. This is back in 2003. Okay. George W. Bush was the president at the time. And let's assume that George Bush had the following attitude. Let's assume that he had the attitude that, you know, I am not the type of person to go to war with a country like Iraq that doesn't pose a significant threat to America. But it turns out that once we invaded Iraq back in 2003, the belief was that they had weapons of mass destruction that they could use against the US, and we had to go in there, right? And when we got there, we found out there were no weapons of mass destruction at all. They didn't seem to pose a threat to the US. And so effectively, his behavior going into Iraq was, well, I went to war with Iraq, but they didn't pose a significant threat to America. So in other words, the attitude that he has, that we're assuming he has, conflicts with the behavior that he engaged in. So the question is this going to produce cognitive dissonance? And if so, then how might he get rid of cognitive dissonance? Okay. Well, certainly the attitude and the behavior conflict with one another, right? That's pretty obvious to see. And we can't say necessarily that he had sufficient justification for engaging in it. So maybe he had insufficient justification that would create this cognitive dissonance. So let's look at some strategies that he could have engaged in to reduce his cognitive dissonance. So these are the 5 strategies that I gave you guys. All right. Let's look at each one in turn to see how that would apply to this case. So the first thing that we can look at is whether he could change his attitude. Well, his attitude is that, remember, we were assuming his attitude was he's not the type of person to go to war with a country that doesn't pose a threat to the US, so he could change his attitude. You know what? I am the type of person to go to war with a country that doesn't pose a threat. I'm a warmonger. Well, that's probably not going to work, right? So that requires him to convince himself that he's just going to go to war with countries randomly. That's probably not going to work as a good strategy. So that one we're going to say is out. Let's try another one. He could change his behavior, right? He could stop going to war with Iraq. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of political reasons why that's not going to look good on him if he goes to war and then just stops and he's changing his mind on this. For political reasons, that's probably not going to work so well. So that strategy is probably out. Let's look at another strategy. Minimize the importance of the conflict. So in other words, we acknowledge that the conflict exists, but we say it's not a big deal. Who cares? It's not that important that I went to war with a country, right? Well, it's probably pretty hard to convince himself that it's not a big deal to go to war. That's probably not going to work as a way to reduce his dissonance. Let's try another one. Reduce perceived choice. What if he convinced himself that he was forced into it, right? Well, the problem is that he's, perhaps the most powerful man in the world, the leader of the free world at that point. It's probably hard to say that he had no choice but to go to war. So that's probably not going to work as well to reduce perceived choice. But there's one strategy left. That's adding consonant cognitions. Remember, adding consonant cognitions means you're adding a belief that's consistent with your behavior and your attitude. So for instance, you know what? We went to war with Iraq, not just to save America, but also to give freedom to the Iraqi people who were suffering under Saddam Hussein's regime. Right? We went to give freedom to the Iraqi people. Giving freedom to people is consistent with my belief that I'm not a warmonger, and it's consistent with my behavior that I went to war. So in fact, this strategy actually works to reduce dissonance. So what we can see, or actually if you look historically at the justification for going to war leading up to the invasion of Iraq versus after we got to Iraq, that justification shifted. Going into it, leading into the war, the justification is we were going to war to protect America. And then after we got to Iraq, we found out they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. The emphasis shifted, the justification shifted into going to war to give freedom to the Iraqi people. And there's a couple of ways that we can look at it. One way is to say, well, these people were lying. That's possible. Maybe Bush and everybody else were lying to everybody about the reason for going to war. Maybe they wanted to get oil, as some people said in the chat. Maybe that's possible. And when they realize their justification for going to war doesn't hold up, they're lying, and they're just making up another reason for going to war to give freedom to the Iraqi people. And that's possible. But another possibility is that maybe they experienced cognitive dissonance. Maybe the real reason that they wanted to go to war in the first place was to protect America, but they couldn't use that justification when they got to Iraq. And so that produced massive amounts of cognitive dissonance that they had to reduce somehow. And the way to reduce that cognitive dissonance was to say they went to war to give freedom to the Iraqi people. Now, I will leave it up to you to decide which of those two you would rather believe. But you could make an argument at least for both of those. Incidentally, I will mention this now that just because it's timely. Now that Trump had COVID, he was just released, right? He came back from the hospital yesterday, I think it was. Well, you could interpret what's happening here from a cognitive dissonance perspective as well. Because he's been talking about how COVID's not a big deal, it's not really affecting people, and then he got affected and had to go to the hospital, right? So you could argue that what he's doing right now is trying to minimize the importance of the conflict. So he released a tweet, was it today or yesterday, saying COVID's not a big deal. Now, don't listen to it, COVID is a big deal. It is very dangerous. But that tweet saying it's not a big deal, you could interpret as saying he's trying to minimize the importance of the conflict. It's not a big deal if you get COVID, and if he feels he's responsible for people getting COVID, it's not a big deal if they do, right? You could interpret that as a way to reduce his dissonance. Of course, just like in the Bush case, it also could be the case that he's lying. Though, again, I'll leave it up to people to decide. But let's look at some other hypothetical examples. And what I want you to do is to give me ways that the people in these situations might reduce their dissonance. And I definitely want you to pay attention here, because the assignment that I'm going to have you do that's due on Friday, this is basically what you're going to have to do. So you might as well get some practice with it now. And so I'll have people give me some responses in the chat. So imagine the following scenario. Ed is a big believer in Ouija boards, and he has used them hundreds of times. He's recently been told that Ouija board phenomena are the result of the ideomotor effect. I'll explain what that is in a second. And they don't actually let people talk to the dead. Okay. So if you've ever used a Ouija board, you know that supposedly you can use them to talk to the dead. That's not what they actually do, but let me describe how it works. So a Ouija board, you've got this flat board with letters and numbers on it, and you've got what's called a planchette, which is this kind of white creamish thing here. And so you have people put their hands on that planchette, just like they're doing in the picture, very, very lightly. They ask questions supposedly to ghosts and spirits that are around. And these ghosts and spirits are supposedly moving your hands around and spelling out answers to their questions. Okay. Now, that's not how Ouija boards actually work. Ouija boards don't let you talk to the dead. What happens is, due to something called the ideomotor effect, which is if you're trying to hold your hand steady, you can see that it shakes just a little bit. It's almost impossible to keep it steady, right? And if you put your hand really lightly on something, those little tiny tremors can get amplified and can start moving this planchette around. Now, the planchette has it's like a tripod. There's 3 points of contact, and there's felt on it, so it slips and slides really easily. And so what happens is that if you ask a question and you're expecting to get a certain answer, those expectations get translated through the slight little tremors in your hands and start moving that planchette around. Now, it doesn't feel as if you're moving it. You're not consciously trying to move it, but your expectations are effectively what's moving that planchette around. Okay? All right. So let's say that Ed has used these Ouija boards. His behavior is I use Ouija boards a lot. And if he were to accept my explanation, in fact, Ouija boards don't let you talk to the dead, he would have an attitude that conflicts with that behavior, right? That would produce a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so my question to you is, using those 5 strategies that I outlined for how to reduce cognitive dissonance, what might Ed do in this case to reduce his cognitive dissonance? Give me some answers in the chat. Okay, so change behavior. What does that mean? Yeah, I mean, don't just tell me the strategies. Give me an example of what he'd be doing. Stop using it. Okay, perfect. So stop using the Ouija board is an example of changing his behavior, right? If he stops using Ouija boards, then he's not behaving inconsistently with his attitudes anymore. Sure. He could downplay the science behind it. Yeah, so he could reject what I'm saying to him, right? He could maybe not believe me. In other words, he could change his attitude, right? In other words, so if he doesn't believe what I'm saying, he could still maintain his belief that they allow people to talk to the dead. He could say, who cares, I'm having fun. Perfect. So he could say, he's basically minimizing the importance of the conflict in that case, right? What he's saying is like, look, I know they don't really let me talk to the dead, but who cares? I'm just having fun with it. It's not a big deal. That's minimizing the importance of the conflict. Good, good. Saying he was forced to use it. Yeah, so what he could do is say something like, well, I was at a party and people just brought it out and I went along with it because what else am I going to do? Of course I'm going to go along with it. I'm basically forced into it. That's basically reducing his perceived choice in that case, right? Okay, and some other interesting strategies people came up with. Ideomotor effect is caused by ghosts. I've never heard that one before, but interesting. Okay, I think we hit all the ones that I was thinking of. Yeah, those are the 4 that I came up with. There might be other ones as well that you've come up with, but those are all good examples. Okay, how about this scenario? John has always claimed that he wanted to date girls that were intelligent and generous, and that attractiveness doesn't matter to him. But recently he met Kate, who's extremely attractive, but not at all intelligent and somewhat self-centered. Nonetheless, John dates her. Okay, so his attitude is, I don't date girls for their looks, but now he's dating a girl for her looks. How might John reduce the cognitive dissonance that's created by this? Stop dating her. Sure, change your behavior. Stop dating her. But in this case, that's theoretically possible. In this case, John probably doesn't want to stop dating her. So what else could he do? Okay, so convince, there's a lot of answers. So convince himself that she has other good qualities. Yeah, that's a good example. So what he could say is, wait, did I not say I like loyalty? Did I not say loyalty is really important to me? Because she's really loyal, right? So what he's doing is he's adding a consonant cognition. I date girls who are loyal, and that's consistent with my behavior and consistent with my attitude. That's adding a consonant cognition. It's good. Minimize the importance, say intelligence isn't really important in dating someone. Or I'll do one better. Minimize the importance by saying, you know what, I'm only dating casually. I'm not going to marry her. This is only for short-term dating, so it's not that big a deal. That'd be a good example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. He can convince himself she's not that dumb. Yep, that's true as well. If he can convince himself, in fact, she really is intelligent. I mean, she doesn't get good grades in school, but she's street smart, I'll tell you what, and that's what I'm looking for in a girl. Say society or his friends push him into dating a pretty person. Okay, so that's kind of like reducing perceived choice to an extent. I had to go out. I mean, I was set up by my friends. I had to go out with her. I had no choice in the matter. Or saying something like, there's just no one else in this city I could possibly date, so she's the only person. I had no other option. Right? So these are all good examples of different strategies people might take to reduce their dissonance. Incidentally, which strategy people take is usually based on which path is the easiest for them. So in this case, breaking up with Kate may be a little more difficult than convincing himself that she's got these other qualities that he likes. So adding a constant cognition might be easier than changing behavior. That's going to depend, though, from person to person, which strategy they find easiest to engage in. Okay, so we give examples of all these here. You have plenty of food to eat and receive high quality medical care. Millions of people in the world are starving and don't have access to the simplest of medical treatments. If you gave more money to charity, you could save lives. Okay. Now, when I bring this up to people, that should tend to produce dissonance, right? The idea being that your attitude, for most of you, should be, I care about other people, I care about the suffering of others, but you're not engaging in certain behaviors that might alleviate some of that suffering, right? If you donated money, maybe some child has food to eat that they wouldn't have had otherwise, right? And so in a sense, you could think of yourself as being responsible for their suffering. At least that's how I might phrase it to people. And if I were to do that, you might experience some cognitive dissonance, right? So how might you get rid of that cognitive dissonance? Okay, so here's a few examples. So you could say there's too many people in the world, so donating money won't make a difference. Right, so what's that an example of? That's minimizing the importance of the conflict, right? Yeah, I don't donate money, but it doesn't matter because they wouldn't get it anyway, so it doesn't make a difference. That's minimizing the importance of the conflict, okay? Change behavior by donating to charities. Sure, you could change your behavior, that's true. Convince yourself that the money you donate will be stolen. Yeah, so you could say, well, that money doesn't get to the people in need, it gets taken up by CEOs of these charities and things like that. In that case, again, what you're doing is effectively minimizing the importance of the conflict. It doesn't matter if you donate money because it wouldn't have gotten to the people anyway. Right? Or you guys are college students. You could say, you know what, I'm a poor college student. I don't have expendable income. I don't have money to give. That's reducing perceived choice. Or, I mean, theoretically, you could change your attitude and you could say, well, I don't really care about the suffering of others. I mean, theoretically, you could. I hope you don't do that. But that would be theoretically a way to get rid of dissonance. Okay, so I think we came up with examples for all of these. So this is good. So you can see that for any situation that produces dissonance, there's at least theoretically a whole bunch of different ways that we have of reducing cognitive dissonance. One more, number 4. You're a member, you have to put yourself about 10 years ago. You're a member of a group that thinks the world will end on October 21st, 2011. This is a real end of the world group. You can see that they're saying the world is gonna begin to end on May 21st, 2011. To join this group, what you do is cult, basically. You sell all of your possessions. You cut off your family and your friends because they don't like the fact that you're part of this group. So you sell all your possessions, you quit school, you quit your job, you cut off your friends and family. October 21st passes and the world doesn't end. Okay, so we are going to look at some ways we have of reducing dissonance for this example next class, because what this example is getting at is part of the second domain in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects, when we have to justify our past behavior. And we're going to see that even in these extreme scenarios where people give up everything in their life for a belief that is then proven wrong, that's going to produce massive amounts of dissonance. And we're going to see how people from this very cult, and how people from other cults as well, how they have come to justify the effort that they engaged in order to join that group for beliefs that were proven wrong. So we're going to look at that next class. But we're not done yet, because before we leave, I want to describe to you the assignment that's going to be due on Friday. What I'm going to do in a second is show you just like a 2-minute long video clip from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, just to give you a little bit of background of this show. Okay, there are 4 main characters in the scene and they basically they own and work at a bar. And what they've noticed is that in the prior few days, they've been making a lot more money, and they usually lose money. in this bar, but they've been making a lot more money at this bar. And they've come to realize that the reason they're making more money is because underage people have been sneaking into the bar. So they're faced with a bit of a problem because they know they shouldn't be serving alcohol to underage kids. On the other hand, they're making a lot of money by doing so. So I'm going to show you a clip where you're going to see how this produces cognitive dissonance. And I'm not saying the writers have any concept of what cognitive dissonance is. I have no idea if they do or not. But looking at it from a social psychologist perspective, we can see that this is producing cognitive dissonance in these characters, and we're going to see how they reduce that dissonance. Now, what you're going to have to do for this assignment is you're going to have to answer a few questions about this. You're going to have to answer, first off, what is producing that cognitive dissonance? What is the psychological conflict that's producing the difference? You're going to have to answer, how did they reduce their dissonance? So I want you to tell me which of the 5 strategies they used and how they used that strategy to reduce their dissonance. And then you're going to have to answer questions about 2 alternative ways, strategies they could have used to reduce their dissonance. This is all written down on the assignment. If you go to Canvas, you'll see that assignment on there, so you can see exactly how these questions are laid out. But let me show you this video clip so you can see what I'm talking about. So pay attention, because again, you're going to have to answer questions based on this video clip. Okay. Oops. Now I think that you should be able to hear my my audio. If you're not able to hear audio, just type it into the group chat and I'll fix that, but I think you should be able to.
Yeah, but I don't understand how you guys could let this happen.
It was not my fault. I was working behind the bar.
Come on, Dennis. You remember what it was like in high school. The minute that we caught word that a bar wasn't carding, we would just pack the place the following weekend.
They probably had a recon crew come in last week.
Oh, we definitely had a recon.
Why, you guys? Why were we not carding? Not my job, dude.
Not my job either.
Not your. It's all of our jobs. Dude, we could get into a lot of trouble for this.
And we also have a social responsibility to keep teenagers from drinking.
I guess.
Well, I don't know about that, though.
Oh, Matt.
No, wait, hold on. Okay, hold on a second. Hear me out, though. Hear me out. It wasn't that long ago that we were in the same position as these youngsters, right? I mean, we get kicked out of some bar, and what do, Dan? We would get a bunch of 40s from a homeless guy, and we'd go sit in some park, right?
That is true.
That is true.
Absolutely
and what
true.
would happen? We would almost get raped and or murdered and or stabbed by the crackheads in Fairmount Park.
You want to know what would happen? We drove Nikki Potnick's car into a tree on Kelly Drive.
With Sweet Tea in the back seat, puking all over the headrest because some guy talked to her that she liked. Remember that? Every time some guy talks to you that you like, you get so nervous, you drink yourself into oblivion.
Salad.
You abused alcohol, and that's okay, but it's very dangerous, right? Right? Okay, well, maybe we should look at this whole thing from a different angle. Maybe we have a social responsibility to provide a safe haven for these kids to be kids. You know, experiment.
No, I don't like where this is heading.
We would have to set up ground rules.
Okay, no drinking and driving. No one's gonna crash Nikki Potnick's car,
Right.
you know? Everyone has to take a cab.
4 drink maximum. Like, that's it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's it. Anyone causing trouble can't come. If you're gonna be here, you gotta be cool.
He's gone.
And
gone.
listen, we water down the drinks, jack up the
Oh,
prices,
my-
where I can
come
make a
on.
serious profit off these kids.
And they have no idea what the hell's going on. We would actually be doing something good.
Great, I say we do it.
Yeah.
I don't know how you guys live with yourselves.
One day at a time.
One day
At a time.
Okay. I'm seeing, there we go. I'm seeing that some people said it was a little laggy for them. If that's the case, I think you could find these episodes on, is it Netflix that has them? I think they're on a bunch of different sites. I think possibly Hulu as well. I have, on the assignment, I mentioned the episode it's taken from, so you can find the exact episode. And then if it's too laggy to watch it here, you can watch it on your own time as well. Okay. So this is going to be due on Friday. Again, that's from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Actually, I'll tell you the episode right now. I have it right here. Actually, what I will do, let me just share my screen with you guys. So this is the assignment that you will see in Canvas. Okay. It's from season 1, episode 3, entitled Underage Drinking a National Concern. And here's the timestamp so you can find that clip. Okay. And here are the 3 questions that I want you to answer. First off, what caused the character's cognitive dissonance? What I do not want is an answer like their behavior conflicted with their attitudes. No, that's not going to get any points. What is the behavior that conflicted with what attitude? Okay. I want you to define what that attitude and what that behavior is. Secondly, how did they reduce their dissonance? So again, mention which of the 5 strategies you believe that they used, and then describe how they used it to reduce their dissonance. And then finally, question 3 is provide 2 alternative ways they could have reduced their dissonance. So of those 5 strategies, not including the one they actually used, pick 2 other strategies they could have used and describe how they could have used them to reduce their dissonance. Okay. Again, you can find that in the assignment section on Canvas. Are there any, okay, there's on YouTube, there we go. That works as well. You don't have to describe it for each character, just one time overall for in general, how did the characters reduce their dissonance? Any other questions about that assignment? There's not a word count. You shouldn't have to write too much on this assignment. I'm only looking for a couple sentences for each section. In fact, the first question on what caused the dissonance, you could probably answer in 1 sentence. The next 2, part B and C, you might just be a couple sentences each. It shouldn't be more than like a paragraph, basically, for the whole thing. Yes, prove you understand the concept, exactly. Yeah, and no top hat today. So keep in mind on Thursday, we will be having a top hat quiz because we won't be live on next Tuesday. So we're gonna have a top hat quiz on Thursday, keep that in mind. And then again, assignments due 5 o'clock this Friday. Okay, thanks everybody. I will, and I'll put the recording, I'm gonna pre-record Tuesday's lecture probably on Friday. I'll try to get it posted on YouTube on Friday. All right, I will see you guys then on Thursday. Have a good one. Bye.